So I don't know about you, but I love a fridge magnet. Anybody else have a collection on their fridge at home? It's just me then. We've got quite a collection. Some of our fridge magnets, they tend to be my fridge magnets, I've got to say. Some of my fridge magnets have a purpose because they hold all the letters from Elton High School that I seem to get. You know, when Liz is doing football, when there's netball, this business. Some are memories from holidays that we've been on. And you look at them and you think, oh, you remember that time? But some have sayings on them. And this is one of my favourites. Cleaning the house when children are growing is like shoveling snow when it's still snowing. Can you relate? I'll repeat it. Cleaning the house when children are growing is like shoveling snow while it's still snowing. I'm sure lots of you can relate to that. This happened to me yesterday. You spend all day washing. You finally empty the laundry basket. Everything is washed and dried. You breathe a big sigh of relief. Next morning, the basket is half full again. Or for those of us in education, every September comes round and everything starts again. And you think, you know what? I've been here before. These are really relatively mundane things that frustrate us. But then there's also the big things that completely distress us, isn't there? And remember, as we've been looking at Ecclesiastes, Qoheleth agrees. And as we've been seeing these past few weeks, this is a person who looks at life and just can't find a purpose or a meaning for all the things under the sun as he describes life. And Qoheleth describes life as vapor. Some translations say meaningless. What's the point? Now, I was going to demonstrate blowing a bubble today. I went yesterday to B&M. I got the bubble mixture, and I must have bought the only defective bubble mixture in B&M because it doesn't work. But you've ever had a bubble mixture, and you blow the bubble, and the bubble pops. There's nothing there after the bubble pops. That's the illustration of what it means, what Qoheleth is trying to say. Our life is vapor, havel. And over the past 2 weeks, Tristan's been given a window into Qoheleth's mind, his emotions, his frustrations, the things that keep him awake at night. And if we're honest, sorry, my pages are stuck together. If we're honest and truly think about it, we've all probably felt his frustration at some point in our lives. But today, we're going to look at what is probably the most famous part of Ecclesiastes. If you were to think, oh, do I know any verses from Ecclesiastes? These verses are probably the ones who are going to come into your mind. Now, if you are a certain age, you might remember the song in the 60s by the Byrds called Turn, Turn, Turn. Does anybody remember that? Oh, are you letting on how old you are there, Tristan? Peter, a few weeks ago, he was singing it to me. Now, the Byrds didn't write this song. I've just mentioned you there, Peter. The Byrds didn't write this song. It was written by a folk singer at the start of the Vietnam War as an anti-war song. But the lyrics are taken from these first 8 verses of Ecclesiastes 3. Now, as we read, it's going to come up on the screen, I hope. As we read, bear in mind that the teacher of who's writing Ecclesiastes wants to bring together the big picture, the whole of life, with the individual parts of life, the seasons of life. So he's looked at the big picture, and now it's as though he is focusing in on the seasons of life. Now, we're going to read 15 verses, but today we're going to look at it in 2 sections. And I'm going to read from the Good News Bible. Don't normally do that, but the Good News Bible really explains this passage well. So this is Ecclesiastes. We'll do verses 1 to 8 first in the Good News version. Everything that happens in this world happens at the time God chooses. He sets the time for birth and the time for death, the time for planting and the time for pulling up, the time for killing and the time for healing, the time for tearing down and the time for building. He sets the time for sorrow and the time for joy, the time for mourning and the time for dancing, the time for making love and the time for not making love, the time for kissing and the time for not kissing. He sets the time for finding and the time for losing, the time for saving and the time for throwing away, the time for tearing and the time for mending, the time for silence and the time for talk. He sets the time for love and the time for hate, the time for war and the time for peace. We'll read the second half of the passage later. The first thing we're going to look at today is the fact that time is in God's hands. Now, as I've studied this passage, I've struggled with these verses, especially verses 3 and 8. Is God really saying it's okay to hate? Verse 3, the time for killing and the time for healing. Is killing is it ever good? Is it ever okay? Verse 8, he sets the time for love and the time for hate. Is that really okay? But as I've studied this passage, people much brainier than me have shed light on my confusion. Firstly, the thing we've got to remember is this is a poem. And as with all poetry, those of you who have ever done English, there is often picture language used. This poem describes the complexity of life. Have you noticed that in verse 2, the teacher starts off logically, the time for birth, the time for death. But after that, there is no logic, seemingly, to the order of the verses. Doesn't that sum up life? Often, there seems to be no logic to our life. Things happen that we can't explain. Now, in the passage, some statements are opposite, and it's obvious that one's good and one's bad. The time for killing, time for healing. The time for love, the time for hate. But there's also some opposites that have no moral value attached to them. Planting and pulling up, tearing down and building, finding and losing. Each of these times can be beneficial when done at the right time, or detrimental when done at the wrong time. And this poem also shows our connectedness to each other. No one lives in a vacuum. We are designed to be relational beings. So, how does this poem connect to Coalesce Search for Meaning? First of all, it's important to know that this poem is not a list of rules or instructions. It's not a case of, okay, chaps, now go off and do some killing or some hating. It's a description of the realities of life, ups and downs, good times and bad. Now, that makes a massive difference, doesn't it? The poem describes some of the experiences we will all have in our lifetime, the seasons of our life. These things happen to us. We do not choose them. They are the extremes of life, death, love, hate, and everything in between. But the poem is not a list of instructions or rules. That's one thing we need to remember. Now, your translation might say there's a time. And I've deliberately chosen the Good News because it says the time. So if your translation says there is a time, does that mean that we control the seasons of our life and when they occur? Some people would say, yes, I do. I am in control of my own destiny. I I am the captain of my own ship. I am the one who makes things in my life happen. Some people actually think that. Now, as some of you know, I love belting out a good Bon Jovi tune. And here are the lyrics of one of them. It's my life. It's now or never. I ain't going to live forever. I just want to live while I'm alive. It's my life. My heart is like an open highway. Like Frankie said, Fred, you'll know this, I did it my way. I just want to live while I'm alive. It's my life. And that's what lots of people think, isn't it? What John Bon Jovi is saying is, I'm in charge. I control things. It's my life. Some other people would say, it does. The universe decides my fate. My future is decided by which star sign I am born under. A tall, handsome stranger awaits, or a lottery win is on the cards because the moon and certain stars are all in the right order. Some people would say, it does. It controls my life. Some people say, I do. Some people say, it does. Some people might say, they do. This is happening to me because they did or didn't do this or that. Now, as I say, I chose the Good News Translation because it says the time. God says he controls the seasons of our life. God says he controls the seasons of our life. Look at verse 1. Everything happens in this world happens at the time God chooses. Now, I don't know about you, but that makes loads of questions pop around my head like nothing. Is God a puppeteer pulling everyone's strings for his own amusement and deliberately giving us hard times when it gives him a bit of a laugh? No. This passage doesn't promote fatalism. God has all the control over my life, so why bother? Or, this is a really difficult time, so God must be punishing me. This passage doesn't say that. This passage encourages balance. God sets the times and seasons of our lives, but what we do with them is our responsibility. I'll repeat that. God sets the seasons of our lives, but what we do with them is our responsibility. It's saying that the realities of living in this fallen world, there will be ups and downs. There's going to be seasons of plenty and seasons of difficulty. But it's an act of faith to believe that if God sets the seasons of our life, then there must be a purpose to it. God never wastes his time. And how we respond to the times God gives us is all important. Do we rebel or do we cooperate? In each season of our life, do we ask God what he's saying to us? God gives us the freedom to decide which way to react. And it's easy, isn't it, to presume we know what God is saying when things are going well. It's really easy. It's easy to accept our season then, but a lot harder when things are going badly. It's much, much harder, isn't it, to accept in this season, God, what are you teaching me in this season? When we or a loved one are ill, it's hard, isn't it? When we get made redundant, when we pray for someone's healing and they're not healed, when we have prayed for someone for years that they would accept Christ and they don't. It's really hard then to accept that this is the season. C.S. Lewis wrote this: God whispers to us in our pleasures. speaks in our conscience, but shouts in our pain. It is his megaphone to rouse a deaf world. God speaks to us in every season of our life, but are we ready to listen? He wants us to be discerning about time, knowing and accepting the season that we're in, trusting that he is in it, and find a way to be happy in it. Have you noticed that in verse 8 of the poem, it ends with a time for peace? Have you noticed also how the writer swaps over the comparison? Verse 8, he sets the time for love and the time for hate, the time for war and the time for peace. Now, in this instance, peace just doesn't mean an end to war, but it means shalom, wholeness. God wants the shalom, the wholeness that trusting God for our times and seasons brings. So, now we're going to move to the next thing that the teacher is contemplating in verses 9 to 15. Aidan, can we have 9 to 15 on? Thank you. The teacher is back to his old musings. What do we gain from all our work? I know the heavy burdens that God has laid on us. He has set the right time for everything. He has given us a desire to know the future, but never gives us the satisfaction of fully understanding what he does. So I realize that all we can do is be happy and do the best we can while we're still alive. All of us should eat and drink and enjoy what we've worked for. It is God's gift. I know that everything God does will last forever. You can't add anything to it or take anything away from it. And one thing God does is to make us stand in awe of him. Whatever happens or can happen has already happened before. God makes the same thing happen again and again. So what these verses are teaching us is that we need to trust God with the tapestry of our lives. We'll come to what that means in a minute. So in verse 9, Koheleth is back to his original argument, isn't it? He acknowledges that there are seasons in his life, but he struggles with the why question. What's the point? What do we gain from all our work? Does God give humanity a task just to keep them out of mischief? Verse 11 is the key here. In the good news, it says, he has set the right time for everything. He has given us a desire to know the future, but never gives us the satisfaction of fully understanding what he does. In some versions, it might say, he has set eternity in the human heart. Now, before I studied this, I always thought that this meant that everyone has a longing for heaven, whether they recognize it or not. However, it's much bigger than that. And that's why I think the good news phrases it well. He, God, has given us a desire to know the future, but never gives us the satisfaction of fully understanding what he does. In this instance, eternity, or in Hebrew it's olam, is not heaven, but an awareness of the expanse of time, backward and forward. God has given us the capacity to remember yesterday. He's given us the capacity to plan for tomorrow and to consider abstract principles. Like, E equals MC squared. It's an abstract principle. We can't see it, but God has given us that ability. Now, the problem is that we long to know the whole picture of our life. We long to know it. What am I going to be doing 2 years from now? We long to know it. But in his kindness, God only reveals it to us in parts. Because if we saw it all, we wouldn't understand it, or we'd be so overwhelmed by it that we wouldn't be able to cope with it. It's as though we were looking at our life on one side of a cross stitch. Now, when I was younger and single, I used to do cross stitch. I found this in the cupboard. Imagine your life as a tapestry. And the problem is that we only see the back of the tapestry. We see the stitches. We are only looking at our life on the back of this cross stitch. We see the threads of our life, but often they look messy. There's knots in it. We know there's been mistakes and where we've had to undo our stitching and start again. Often, we can't see what the picture is meant to be. But God is on the opposite side. He's not constrained by time, so he sees the full picture. He sees how our successes and failures contribute to the whole picture. He knows when you are following him closely and following his pattern, but he also knows when you went wrong and had to come back to where you started. He knows the seasons of your life when things were difficult, when it was a struggle just to put a stitch in. The bits when